for the intro.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the Colonial Society of Massachusetts. We're very pleased to present this special program today to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the publication of Phillis Wheatley Peters' poem on various subjects, religious and moral, the first book written by an enslaved Black woman in America. It is my pleasure to introduce our panelists. Danielle LaGrosse-George is a poet, translator, and editor. She is the author of several books of poetry, including Maroon, The Dear Remote Nearness of You, and Island Heart, translations of the poems of 20th century Haitian French poet Ida Faubert. In 2014, LaGrosse-George was named Boston's Poet Laureate. She is a contributing editor of Consequence Forum and Salamander Magazine, the creative editor of SX Salon, a digital forum for explorations of Caribbean literature, and Professor Emeritus of Creative Writing at Lesley University. Our trust, Bethany White, is Associate Professor of English at East Stroudsburg University, part of the Penn State University system. She is a poet, essayist, and literary critic. She is the recipient of the Trio Award for her poetry collection, My Afmerica Poems. Her prose, Survivor's Guilt, Essays on Race and American Identity, received a 2022 Next Generation Finalist Indie Book Award. Lamerchi Frazier, visual activist, public historian, educator, commissioned public artist, innovator, and poet, is Executive Director of Creative and Strategic Planning for Spoke Arts, and was formerly Director of Education and Interpretation for the Museum of African American History in Boston and Nantucket. She was awarded the Boston Foundation Brother Thomas Fellowship. She is a member of the City of Boston Reparations Task Force, and she is the State of Massachusetts Arts Commissioner. Before I turn the podium over to our panelists, I would like to let those who are watching the live stream know that if they have questions for our speakers, they may email them to colonialsociety@verizon.net, and we will address them at the end of the program. Again, that email is colonialsociety@verizon.net. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Anne. I guess we sit here, or do we go to the podium?
It's your preference.
All right. I'll go to the podium. Thank you, Anne. Thanks also to Megan Holmes. And special thanks goes to Bob Allison for the invitation to present more than a year ago, which led to the seed that grew into the Wheatley at 250 anthology. I'd like to acknowledge Pangyris, the presence of Amanda Lewis, who is trying to sneak into one of the editors of Pangyris, which is publishing the anthology, and members of the New England Poetry Club who are here with us this afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm super happy about this presentation and glad to be with my colleagues. Each of us will provide introductory and contextual remarks on Wheatley and the anthology, about 5 minutes each before sharing some of its contents with you. I'll begin. Phillis Wheatley Peters, author of the 1773 book, Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, has been called and is many things, including the African girl enslaved by Boston's Wheatley family in 1761, and the acclaimed 18th century transcontinental poet. In a magnificent 2006 essay entitled The Difficult Miracle of Black Poetry in America, the poet June Jordan names Wheatley the first decidedly American poet on this continent by virtue of the keen attention Wheatley paid to the turbulent events of her time and the revolutionaries who would forge America. Wheatley was witnessing and documenting the emergence of this country. Historian Henry Louis Gates Jr. situates Wheatley squarely in the colonial and post-colonial debates that sought to confirm or dismiss Black intelligence. Wheatley was a noted poet in her day and was thrust into a cosmopolitan sphere and found herself in conversation with such figures as George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. Here she was, this teenager, Black teenager, talking to these dudes, right? As well as posthumously with Thomas Jefferson, whose 1785 notes on the state of Virginia preferred scathing and undeserved, we would argue, criticism. To recognize Wheatley's intelligence and talent would have been to recognize the intelligence and talent of those who had been enslaved by Jefferson and all enslaved individuals. Endorsers of Wheatley's 1773 book identified themselves as among the, quote, most respectable characters in Boston. These are the people who, in current terms, blurbed her book, right? And they included the governor and lieutenant governor of Massachusetts. Of her poems, they remarked, she's been examined by some of the best judges and is thought qualified to write them. Less restrained, David Wallstreicher, recent Wheatley biography, notes, she became fluent and culturally literate and able to write poems in English so quickly that we shouldn't hesitate to call her a genius. Recent scholarly attention to Wheatley's work includes Honoré Fanon Jeffers' well-researched 2020 collection of poems, The Age of Phillis. Jeffers advances the argument for referring to Wheatley by her married name, Wheatley Peters, thereby liberating Wheatley Peters from perpetual historical adolescence. We can separate the celebrated and enslaved teenage poet from the free and married author. And I wonder if we can move to the next slide. Thank you. Flourish of curtains. Tara Bynum, a scholar of literary histories, in her 2023 Reading Pleasures, Everyday Black Living in Early America, deepens our understanding of Wheatley's inner life by identifying not her poems, but her letters as a means by which Wheatley delights in the pleasures of her living in spite of and because of the world at large. She had a long-standing correspondence with a war tanner, an enslaved African woman living in Newport, Rhode Island. Phillis Wheatley Peters called herself an Ethiop and an African and a poet. She was friends. She was a friend to a war tanner, Scipio Moorhead, a young African-American painter, Samson Okum, a Mohegan Presbyterian evangelist, and Selina Hastings, Countess of Huntingdon in England, who was instrumental in the publication of her book of poems. Wheatley saw her verse published in London and Boston on two sides of the Atlantic Ocean. She was wife to John Peters, whom she married in 1778. And historian Cornelia Dayton, a member of the Colonial Society, in her article Lost Years Recovered, John Peters and Phillis Wheatley Peters in Middleton, offers a narrative that runs counter to the popular unfavorable ones regarding what transpired between the Peters. We often have a sense that John Peters was a terrible person, irresponsible. Among John Peters' chief efforts, Dayton notes, was to, quote, insulate his wife from physically taxing housewifery and to create space and time for her to inhabit, a writer daughter's life and to be a mother. An acclaimed writer and political actor in her lifetime, Wheatley would not live to see herself as inspiration for an immense number of scholarly, literary, and creative texts. She would not see the buildings, the lecture halls named for her hundreds of years after her unexpected death in 1784, while she was still in her early 30s. A second manuscript, known to have been circulating at the time of her death, has never been recovered, nor has the exact site of her grave at the Cops Hill Burying Ground in Boston's North End been identified. She was named, or we can say renamed, for the ship that delivered her here to Boston, to the Americas, and into the maw of greed and attempted dehumanization that was the transatlantic slave trade. We will never know her West African name, her true name, the name given to her by her parents, but many call her and claim her as sister, as ancestor. Many name her the mother of African American literature and a luminary of United States letters.
Oh my. So my role is to talk about the process of pulling the anthology together. In my first conversation with Danielle, after assuring her that the anthology project was a brilliant idea and poets would love to have the opportunity to pay homage to Phillis Wheatley Peters in this way, we immediately rolled out our A-list of Black female poets. But then came the process of pairing poets with Wheatley Peters' poems. So we basically played the role of poem matchmakers based on how we thought poets might respond to being assigned particular poems. The scenario went something like this. This poet is youthful and impetuous, so this poem would be a great fit. Or, did you read this poet's latest book? Well, this poem should be a wonderful choice. We were lucky right off the bat. The poets we queried responded positively, and we ended up having a largely cascading list of yeses. Our timeline was fairly tight. We sent out invitation letters in February and requested a June 1st turnaround for craft essay and reimagined Wheatley poem. That said, we were so grateful that everyone was able to deliver on time. While we waited, we wondered, worst case scenario, what if all the poems are too similar? Even in the way that they are arranged on the page, what will we do? So I am happy to report that this definitely did not happen because we actually ensured variation based on the poets we solicited. In our early conversations, both of us named poets whose work we knew from past relationships or just from following their career output. We chose narrative poets, poets who produced concrete poems or were more playful with a poem's use of white space on the page, and poets who worked with sonics or sound as a part of their narrative experience. So the stunning melange of poems we ended up with was both deliberate and accidental. Finally, we used the term Black in the title of the anthology because we have a list of 20 poets who represent the African diaspora, including poets of Jamaican, African, and Haitian descent. This is very representative because while we think of Wheatley Peters as African American, she made that critical middle passage journey from Africa to America. So recognizing her inspirational legacy in an African diasporic manner was important to the ethos of the project. Thank you.
I am asked to give an introduction to Phyllis's geographic space that she took up. And if we think about her as not only local here, internationally, she really covered more than anyone that I can think of in her time who was a black person, who was not only black but also female. So when we think about Phyllis, her story becomes very fascinating as we engender Boston's trade and its traffic in 1750, 1760, as many of the boats that left and returned were returning from Gorée. For those of you who may not know what that is, Gorée is the door of no return in Senegal. It is the port where Africans were taken onto the ships across the Middle Passage. And so as more and more ships were coming from that region, and we see an ad in the Boston Gazette in 1761, and there were several of them, that said, "Just imported from Africa, Negro servants, to be purchased at Long Wharf, number 19. That helps us to understand when Phyllis arrived in July of 1761, the Wheatleys were already primed for her arrival. She is already representing her people who have come across this water by force from the Senegambia region, which on the old maps is written as Ethiopia. So in her reference to her poems of Ethiopia, I take it by license to interpret that that's the Ethiopia she's referring to when she calls Ethiops. So that geographic region is also a part of the space that she occupies. When we think about the dynamics of possession rather than white supremacy, when we think about the dynamic of those who own property by kidnapping and theft of land and bodies, those who were being disposed of their land and property or dispossessed of it as the indigenous people, and those who were deemed property, those who were African and indigenous and enslaved. Those dynamics of property and possession began our understanding of what it was for Phyllis to break boldly and move through this Boston that had her in possession. So when we think about that, her book that becomes published in 1773 is due to many circumstances. One of them is that she's able to travel with Nathaniel Wheatley across the water. He is there to do business. He has been accused of being jealous of Phyllis's acclaim in many circles, and so his concern with her is not one that he does not hesitate to remind her of his mother's letter of introduction of Phyllis to her friend, who is Selina Hastings, the Countess, who is called for her writing to be published. In the letter, Susanna Wheatley wrote to those who are going to receive her, and she says, "I tell Phyllis to act wholly under the directions of your ladyship, Susan Hastings, and I have given her money to buy what you think most proper for her. I like she should be dressed plain." Those comments suggest that Phillis Wheatley may have been exhibiting increasing independence, but there was a cloak over her presence. There is also another letter of introduction by one of those who was called those who was actually named as a juror for her trial. And it is Richard Carey who is addressing the public in this announcement of those 18 men who were accounting for the fact that Phillis had written this work. And in his letter of introduction, he said to the public, which prefaced her volume, "This will be delivered, your ladyship, by Phillis, the Christian poetess, whose behavior in England I wish may be as exemplary as it has been in Boston. This appears remarkable for her humility and spiritual mindedness. Home she will continue an ornament for the Christian name and profession as she grows older and has more experience. I doubt not her writings will run more in evangelical strain." So he was not concerned with her as a poet either. It was that the Wheatleys were among people who were organized as a movement of Christian missionary. And in training of Phillis, it was better that she read the Bible. But they had no understanding quite of what her prowess, her intellectual capacity could deliver. And so as she studies to be ready to be an example of what Christianizing the Negro, and a document delivered in 1706 by Reverend Cotton Mather, what that meant to control enslaved people. As she studies, she is then looking for what may have been a voice of her own birthing, may have been a voice of the griot traditions in the Senegambia regions that she came from and heard as a child. So when we look at the geographies that she represents, it is no doubt that she would be able to not only remember, but to reveal her love of poetry in her work because of where she had come from and where she was geographically situated. And in her poem, Imagination, who can sing thy force, or who's described the swiftness of thy course, soaring through air to find the bright abode, the imperial palace of the thundering God. We only own thy pinions can surpass the wind or leave the rolling universe behind. From star to star the mental optics rove, measure the skies and the range and realms above. There in one view we grasp the mighty whole, or with new worlds amaze the unbounded soul. It speaks to her also her universal understanding of place and the soul and how it manifests itself. So when she meets the London group, she says that Lord Montague took me to the British Library, and then we visited the Royal Academy. And then I read my poetry to the Bloomsbury Circle in the library. Oh, but yesterday at your house, that was my first full stocking salon. There were the Blue Stocking ladies, a society of poetry that was mostly all women, who were also able to read before men, and in the Victorian era, that was a promiscuous audience. But when we talk about Phillis being one of the blue stocking poetess, she's then called the Black Blue Stocking poetess. She is then received not only by the luminaries of England and of London, but she is also seen by the African Georgians who are there, who take her to places like the Painted Hall in the Seamen's Hospital. There is a plaque where her work was published in 1773. She is a part of the movement of women who are arranging themselves to have rights in the literary world. So that's just a brief sketch. I could go on forever. But I'm delighted to be able to talk about Phillis in the realm of universal and international space.
So we're going to move on now to sharing some of the contributions, the entries, the rewritings, and thoughts that the poets, the thoughts of the poets as they were rewriting, or translating, or reinscribing, or covering Phillis Wheatley. So we're going to start with Lamerty.
Oh,
Or we can start with me.
Yes,
I'll start with me. All right. We'll start with me, then we'll go to Lamerty, and then we'll go to our test. All right. So I rewrote or translated or rendered a poem of Phillis Wheatley's entitled "On Being Brought from Africa to America." It's among one of her most famous. And the poem renders problematic who is worthy of humanity, who is worthy of salvation. And Wheatley reminds her readers, especially her white readers, that their Christianity should be the grounds from which they reject racism and slavery. So I'll read to you a little bit of my essay, and then I'll read to you the Wheatley original, and then my remix. Beginning with its titular reference to geographies, "On Being Brought from Africa to America" immediately signaled for me a doubleness to be explored. Repetitions and rhymes, which exist in the original, seemed important in rendering the new text, as did ricochets and off-rhymes. Wheatley Peters appears to address two audiences simultaneously: those who belonged, like her, to the community of enslaved persons, the African, the Negro black as Cain, and the implied user of the slur, the Christian, who is also the enslaver in the Americas. Employing two ontological systems, one in which her savior is greater than the God who allowed her enslavement, and the other in adopted and expected Christianity, Wheatley engages in an act of literary marronage, or marooning. She affirms and admonishes using the very terms of her captors, ultimately collapsing the externally imposed binary established to determine who is worthy of humanity and of heaven. And Wheatley credits mercy as a teacher. "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land." So mercy became a key for me, an element to personify. You'll hear that in my remix. I'll stop there. You can read the rest of the essay in the anthology. Hold on, let's move back to the... Here we go. In the anthology. So I'll read to you the Wheatley original, followed by my rewriting, or my response to it. "On Being Brought from Africa to America. 'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God and there's a Savior too. Once I, redemption, neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train. On being brought from Africa to America, a reinscription. It was mercy indeed who carried me from what was deemed my pagan land. Mercy, you showed my soul to me, taught me to understand that God exists, that something greater exists too. Now, mercy, who knew what you and I knew? Some say and see the dark as dead, as colored by a knot and dread. I say, I name us fully. Cain, daughters exiled, sons of rain. In us the flood, the moon and tides, horizons, uncut shores and lines, and more, the raised and versed libations of the waiting sun. My remix. And then each of us, in addition to sharing our reinscriptions, is sharing a word or two about another contributor in the anthology. So I want to just speak to one of the entries that we were delighted to receive from Pamela Mordecai, a noted Jamaican educator, author of more than 30 books, editor of groundbreaking anthologies of Caribbean women's writing. And she rewrote or translated Wheatley's An Hymn to the Morning, or Hymn to the Morning, into Jamaican patois, or Jamaican Creole. When it came in, we were just like...
Very excited.
So Mordecai notes in her essay, I started translating line by line, straightforward enough, but then comes the juggling of various linguistic and poetical considerations. Poetry in English is mostly literature, she means written. Patois poetry is still mostly orature. Plus, Wheatley writes her poems not just in English, but in a particular classical style. Dawn is Aurora. The muses are ye ever-honored nine. What is Jamaican Creole to make of that? Mordecai asks. Well, call Aurora by another name, and the muses nine high sistren. Mordecai continues, Wheatley uses words like lays, plumes, groves, bowers, gale, vaulted skies, gentle zephyr, fervid beams that would sit uncomfortably in a patois poem. So, fix vocab, massage syntax, and meddle with phonetics. While Louise Bennett, who wrote poetry in patois using traditional forms, like Louise Bennett, who wrote poetry in patois using traditional forms, I often work with rhyme and meter. I can mimic Wheatley's rhyme scheme and prosody. It isn't too long, however, before my poem, Chorus for Clean Day, gets unruly. Pamela Mordecai. I'll read to you the original Wheatley poem and then a couple of stanzas of the Mordecai reinscription or translation. An Hymn to the Morning. Attend my lays, ye ever-honored nine. Assist my labors, and my strains refine. In smoothest numbers, pour the notes along, for bright Aurora now demands thy song. Aurora, hail, and all the thousand dyes which deck thy progress through the vaulted skies. The morn awakes, and wide extends her rays. On every leaf the gentle zephyr plays. Harmonious lays of feathered race resume. Dart the bright eye and shake the painted plume. Ye shady groves, your verdant gloom display to shield your poet from the burning day. Calliope, awake the sacred lyre, while thy fair sisters fan the pleasing fire. The bowers, the gales, the variegated skies. Now, 2 stanzas from Pamela Mordecai's translation. You should know that I am not a native speaker of Jamaican patois. I'll give it a good effort. Chorus for Clean Day. O 9 high sistren, listen to me croonin'. Help bear me burden and fine tune me tuning. Roll out the notes cool, melismatic, scatty, like how bright they clean need a song from me. Big up, O morning, praise the Tucson tint, that pretty up high heaven as you sprint across. They wake and spread him, beam them wide. Soft breeze, take every leaf on a joy ride. You'll find the rest of the poem in. And we just loved how this poem stands in productive and beautiful tension with the extremely formal English of Wheatley and evokes the Atlantic world in which peoples and cultures were mingling and colliding and producing interstitial languages like Jamaican patois, Haitian Creole, other Creoles. So, thank you. So, now Lamerty, yes? Lamerty.
All right. Well, it is indeed my response to being asked. I was so honored to be a part of this anthology and to write on Phyllis's work. And my response right away was, my question was how to respond to her already perfect work. And receiving this request to reinscribe this interpretation of Phillis Wheatley's elegy to a gentleman and a lady on the death of the lady's brother and sister and a child of the named Avis, aged 1 year, was certainly not only an honor, but the consideration of what death meant. Rereading the poem several times, my process was to enter the world of words, expression and voice that was unique to Phillis Wheatley's Peters. I considered the context of her environment, pregnant with freedom and independence, yet with slavery not yet legally ended, and even for her. Identifiable is her 3-pronged challenge as an enslaved Black woman in that space charged and compounded with the complex issues of race and gender. Employing superior linguistic skills, she pushed back to be counted as a talented writer who provided comfort to grieving families in their loss through the literary form of the elegy. The elegy making her, as a device, immortal. Despite being enslaved, Wheatley used elegies to honor and comfort the living who might otherwise be less comforted, and in so doing, gained her importance among men and women of note in Boston and beyond it. Although she deemed physical property, her writing allowed her to create the space for her own intellectual freedom. So as we consider, and you can read this in also, I would like to take this time to read Phyllis's poem. I think the title takes up a lot of time, but I'm going to read it again. To a gentleman and lady on the death of the lady's brother and sister and a child of the name Avis, aged 1 year. On death's domain intent I fix my eyes, where human nature in vast ruin lies. With pensive mind I search the dreary abode, where the great conqueror has his spoils bestowed. There, the offspring of 6,000 years in endless numbers to my view appears. Whole kingdoms in his gloomy den are thrust. and nations mixed with their primeval dust. Insatiate skill, he gluts the ample tomb. His is present, his the age to come. See here a brother, here a sister spread, and a sweet daughter mingled with the dead. But, madam, let your grief be laid aside, and let the fountain of your tears be dried. In vain they flow to wet the dusty plain. Your sighs are wafted to the skies in vain. Your pains they witness, but they can no more, while death's reign tyrant o'er this mortal shore. The glowing stars and silver queen of light at last must perish in the gloom of night. Resign thy friends to that almighty hand which gave them life, and bow to his command. Thine artist, Avis, give without a murmuring heart, though half thy soul be fated to depart. To shining gods consign thine infant care, to waft triumphant through the seeds of air. Her soul enlarged to heavenly pleasure springs. She feeds on truth and uncreated things. Methinks I hear her in the realms above, and leaning forward with a fillet of love, invite you there to share immortal bliss, unknown, untasted, in a state like this. With towering hopes and growing grace arise, and seek beatitude beyond the skies. My reinscription. Here, where death is charged, here at the house of death, where we visit an old friend, where the Lord of its walls calls us to enter, where 3 by 3 we witness the end of human cycles. The wallpaper bears the image of abundant lives, lives now recalled across millennia and their geographies. Now appears the family of our brother, sister, and innocent child. The light closing on their gifts to the coming age, or so it seems. Oh, lady, dry the moisture of your tears, bereft and fearful. Facing what lies ahead, our grieving questions, how can this be? 3 by 3 by 3, a memory. A citrine kite, wind twisted and tethered, we call her name to hear her sing, lullaby floating through the air, clouds breaking. We are cleansed with the liquid soul of Avis. Admonish us to repent, our moral compass balanced 3 by 3, guiding our journey to the house of eternity. Your beauty, short it be, beckons us to see death's grip snatched. Lit sparkles in aurora's beams, light saffron heavens with your unknown dreams. Now reveal our freedom, ongoing journeys, life after life, after life, after life. Introduce another of the poets in the anthology. And I was so pleased to be able to bring forward the words of Janice A. Lowe. Not only is she a wordsmith and a poet, but she is a very unique composer who hails from a place like Dayton, Ohio, where she talks about Paul Laurence Dunbar from the 19th century, and then she collaborates with people like the Pulitzer Prize winning Olio author Tihembe Jess. Her compositions in music and in poetry are astounding. She writes here a praise party, a celebration of divine creation, an ode to all things sunset. My remix of Phillis Wheatley Peters' A Hymn to the Evening interacts with her delight and wonder in the bombast and nuance of the sun's red, orange, light, and color parade through New England skies, and its eventual nightly dramatic descent into Boston's harbor. In Evening, the hymn, her work, I imagine early evening visions and sounds a tender age Phillis may have experienced in the Senegambia region of her earliest years, when she was a free child living with her birth family. Equator close, Africa's latest sunset home. Sky's mango-hued stages waves. Fishermen, pelicans, Atlantic Ocean, Senegal River, Lake Retbas, pink water, coastline, Senegambia shoreline, Boston, maritime, free child in the world before being sold into slavery. I wonder if Wheatley, in those few years after her forced removal from home, remembered hearing Sabah rhythms. And I hope I can do this seamlessly, so that you know what they sound like. Sabah is a happening, a dance, drumming. That gives you a sample of what she's referring to here. Does wordsmith Phillis use words as shining bits of percussion in bigging up Sunset's fascinating promenade? Spurred by Wheatley's love of using words as paint, I color in and around her bond months. In my interplay, words and their insides play as objects, as musical instruments. Other nuances, singing, tint, and texture, syllables and lines that can be read or performed as counterpoint to the original. In her work, and the reason I had you to listen to that, is this sonic poem that she writes in response to the evening hymn. Evening the hymn to Sabah drumming, an impression, a celebration. Abandon ink soon, on, sky thunders, iron, paper granular pearls, essence, floret, lettering, rivulet, drumming, windy, fife, refrain, ray, bird, wobbling, church, Sabar's song left of north. Orange, glorious, us, hip, hum, ming, ether, God's atmosphere, here, shadow of cap to red epiderm is ruby, evening soul, a refresh work. Pamastilled, lead, stolen repose, trunks trapped, trunks tapped, nick, tapped. Janice Hill.
So I'm going to start with my craft essay on Phillis Wheatley's poem To the Right Honorable William Earl of Dartmouth. Afrique's Irony, a word on resistance. To the Right Honorable William Earl of Dartmouth has always been one of my favorite poems to introduce to students when teaching Phillis Wheatley Peters, because it displays a skillful discursive pivot away from Revolutionary era desire to Black liberation politics. Imagine the challenge of curbing a natural boldness, which Wheatley definitely embodied, in order to be seen as an appropriately civil Black girl while enmeshed in 18th century Euro-American and European society. Wheatley was an adroit thinker, intellectual, and cosmopolitan of her day, taking all aspects of her unique subject position into account. In my poem, I capitalize on that essential pivot in Wheatley's original work in order to enhance the metonymic significance of the term Afrique. The diminutive of Africa was clearly an easier fit for the poet's use of iambic pentameter, but it also served to center the continent of Africa as a legitimate place where families, love, and culture abound. Wheatley fretted over her destiny and what her life might have been if she had remained among her African countrymen. For Wheatley, the page became a safe space to articulate uncontested the words of her heart. This form of Black resistance during enslavement often goes unremarked in American educational pedagogies, daring to include the study of early African American literature. The page unequivocally provided a means for Wheatley to resist the racial status quo. The term African American, a nomenclature of descent, is meant to recall the rich history of the African continent and its global presence throughout the African diaspora. Today, so few in America are educated about the continent that the reference has become localized and deferential. Yet in Wheatley's era, the international slave trade was still in full operation, and Africa meant fresh human cargo, easily translatable to saleable goods and wealth. I imagine a colonial-era Phillis caught up in the conundrum of why the masterminds behind the American Revolution could not make the leap from their fear of colonial white slavery to the need to simultaneously dismantle African enslavement with a single revolutionary act. Tellingly, a mere 2 years after the publication of poems on various subjects, religious and moral, Virginia Governor Lord Dunmore would extend freedom to all indentured servants and Negroes who would cast off their rebel masters to fight for the British. In To the Right Honorable William Earl of Dartmouth, Wheatley is aware of how the status of Blacks in the colonies is ripe for change, and that change is in the hands of the British American peerage reigning over them. In using the term Afrique in her poem, the African American poet is demanding to be seen by recalling the continent that produced her and her fellow Africans still being wrongfully monetized for global greed. I'm going to read that pivotal stanza in Phillis Wheatley's original. To the Right Honorable William Earl of Dartmouth, His Majesty's Principal Secretary of State for North America, etc. Should you, my lord, while you peruse my song, wonder from whence my love of freedom sprung, whence flow these wishes for the common good, by feeling hearts alone best understood, I, young in life, by seeming cruel fate, was snatched from Afrique's fancied happy seat. What pangs excruciating must molest, what sorrows labor in my parents' breasts. Steeled was that soul, and by no misery moved, that from a father seized his babe beloved. Such my case, and can I then but pray? Others may never feel tyrannic sway. And now I'll read my reinscription of her poem. To the Right Honorable William, Earl of Dartmouth. Imagine freedom embraces a new day, ending threats of war on tense New England shores, all thanks to Dartmouth, changing the course of history and bending the king's ear to help him see that America is indeed free and not a new land for white and black slavery. Imagine I know all about slavery. Recall the loose-limbed strut of the once free before being torn with a please help from parents at dawn and set on a ship's course, whisking this black girl far from Afrique's shores to pen poems for freedom from Britain Day. Is it resentment you think you hear so free in my verse, brimming with coupled pleas to help you remember me? Afrique, short, of course, for black sorrow on American shores, the endless wait for Emancipation Day to firmly cast off manacled slavery. Great men crave fame, but few extend help to humans in pain. Freedom their right, of course, but we all covet liberty on near and far shores. Even you, Dartmouth, will stand one day beneath God's sternest glare, hopeful and free, or bedeviled for endorsing slavery. Thank you. So I am going to call out Tracy K. Smith, who is the first poet in the anthology, her poem on virtue. You are like the old ladies my mother took me to visit, whose brown hands kept nimble at small things, shelling peas on a porch or in a shady kitchen, stitching the hem of the world's dress, which came loose every so often. I thought you were the gate through which I'd pass into bliss. Ma'am, sister, aunt, saint, what I've learned through ache and shame is a crumb of what you stayed knowing. Joy is a dark jar on a high shelf. A spoonful can last a lifetime. Widow, keeper, mender of light, to what new names do you now answer? What the bowl sighs to the whisk, how thumb greets husk, what night whispers into the nape of dusk.
I think we want to take some Q&A now. So we're mindful of time, and we don't know what time it is. So
It's three.
So Megan and Anne, is it? I don't know if we can do have like a few minutes of Q&A, or if we should.
Of course, yeah.
Okay.
Here we go. Are there any questions from the audience?
Or comments.
Questions, comments? Yep.
Well, I'm Rashad Martin, one of the vice presidents here at the Colonial Society. So I just personally want to, thank the three of you for this tremendous presentation. And we had a Phillis Wheatley school in the Boston Public Schools, where which I'm an administrator, which is now closed. Do you have any thoughts on where the next opportunity could or should be, for the city of Boston to sort of re-elevate, Phillis Wheatley's, sort of historical importance, to our, I think, obviously, at the, well, obviously to our city, but then of course, to our sort of to our country. I feel like we're thinking about, who we should be sort of celebrating or re-celebrating, all the time. So it's something that's, and it's interesting because my mom's name is Phyllis, and so is my grandmother, and and one of my aunts, So it's a very popular name in the family. So.
UMass Boston has a building named after Phillis Wheatley, and so there's been a project to ask its students to recognize who she is, because if you took a microphone around and you asked them who was Phillis Wheatley, most of them did not know. So the efforts to raise the consciousness about who she was and how important she is has been part of an institutional wrapping and embrace. The trails in Boston have also highlighted her work, and there has been a resurgence of information gathered by those who are docents to represent Phyllis in a better light in this city. But I also think that in incorporated is the monument to Phillis Wheatley that's on Commonwealth Avenue, that many people don't know is there, and what it really means to have her in that large space as a large personality. We need to think about what our students might want after they exposed her information, what they might want to manifest for the next generations of this coming century. So I really appreciate your question.
And we'll start back here.
So just today, at the Boston Women's Memorial, the Talking Statues was unveiled, which is a recording of the three women, Abigail Adams, Lucy Stone, and Phyllis Wheatley. And Phyllis Wheatley's recording is read by Ayanna Presley. So you can find that at the QR code at the memorial.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
And we'd like to also add that Phyllis Wheatley's 1773 publishing various subjects religious and more, various poems on subjects religious and more, is not only just a literary presentation of African and African American art form, literary art form, but it is also because of the work of her enslaved next door neighbor, Cyprian Moorhead, the beginning of an African American visual canon of art. And so with that being a 1773 moment, if our public is brought into that understanding of how early people who were enslaved were able to be accomplished and have the talents that they had, and that this book represents that anchor for us as a canon in American history, American literary work, and American visual art. That might be one of the steps we need to reinforce.
And I'd also like to respond very briefly to your really great question, Rashawn. I do feel that we need to continue to expand BPS curriculum, right, to include the story, not only the biography, but the actual work of Phyllis Wheatley Peters, like what she was actually writing about, that she was writing about what was taking place in her world at the time, and also to elevate the work of folks who continue to make Wheatley visible in the city. People like Denise Washington, who has a tour that has folks go to Chinatown to see the plaque that reflects the spot at which she was purchased. I hate to use that word, right? And that, she lived not far from, my directions, I'm a little disoriented, but she lived not far from here on State Street and whatever they were called, the streets were called at the time. So recognizing that Phyllis's presence is very much a part of this city's history. And so continuing to make her presence and her importance visible here. I think
I'd like to add to that as well. Part of the structure of the anthology took this point to mind because we envision perhaps that it might be used as a common read, and that these craft essays would give some access to the intent of her original poem. That way, educators at the middle grade, secondary, and even university level would be more apt to teach her work. So that was a part of the consideration. And as someone who is working with middle grade and secondary education educators to incorporate more voices into those curriculums, right? With ease, I've done workshops, with educators at that level. I think that it definitely can have a major impact on her legacy as well as the legacy of other African American writers.
Thank you so much. I wanted to ask about reimagining, reinventing, rethinking, reformulating. I mean, I think I have a sense of why and the importance of doing it, and you've just answered. And in the work, it's there, but it's like, if you don't mind asking, because I think of a poem in a different context entirely. Orton wrote about Yeats. He says, the words of the dead man are modified in the guts of the living. And then it's sort of in a poem called When the Yeats Dies, he writes this poem where he puts this line. So, and then I think about, Chaucer, for example, being modernized into sort of a contemporary English. And then I'm just thinking, so I'm thinking these things, and I'm thinking Phillis Wheatley at 250, and then should we be doing this with Whitman or with Shakespeare, or whoever we want, and just to reflect a little bit about the value of reimagining and reinventing in contemporary language.
I'm going to respond super quickly, but then we should be doing it more for Wheatley than for Whitman and for Shakespeare, because they're continuously, the latter two are continuously being referenced, right, and reimagined. But someone like Wheatley, less so. So I think it's incumbent upon us, her literary inheritors, her daughters, to lift her up, because she's as important as Shakespeare, in my opinion. I'll speak for myself here. And Whitman, the father, some would argue the father of modern American literature. My quick response.
I agree. I rarely have students come into the university classroom who haven't heard of Whitman and Shakespeare. I don't know if I ever have. But if I ask if they've heard of Phillis Wheatley, it's usually a universal. So, yeah.
I also think that Phillis reimagined, through her study of the classics of Milton and Shakespeare, in her own poetry, she brings them forward as a form. And so they are constantly, as classics, being reiterated, understood, and to add to what Danielle brought forward, her voice has been so hidden that we need the emphasis on why she matters.
Thank you so much. I